So, welcome back. Trust you all had a good lunch? Yeah. So this is the first of 2 workshop sessions. So we're running the same workshops twice over. So big thanks to the speakers because they're going to do it all twice. But it's to give you guys the maximum opportunity to sort of do a couple of these workshops. And we're actually recording the voice, and then we'll marry that up with the slides, and Kate will send that out to you all afterwards. So if there'll be a workshop you missed, but you will also get the information from that at least, etc. After the event. So basically, I'm just going to hand over to our 2 people this afternoon. So we've got 2 sessions here. So we've got one which is a career as a patent attorney, and a number of the speakers this morning referred to that as part of the important mix of people they needed in their scientific companies. And then we have a look at scientific publishing, which I think Daniel sort of touched on very briefly when we talked about the RME. So we've got Kate and we've got Fiona. Thank you very much for being with us. They've both said they're happy to take questions as they work through their input. So the whole idea is to try and make this a little bit more informal than we were in that big lecture theatre this morning. So first of all, forgive me, I didn't bring the 2 sets of glasses, did I? I've had an eye ulcer, and that's why I'm having trouble. I do apologise. So Kate Appleby with Marks and Clerk is going to talk to us about patent attorney. Over to you.
How do I get the slides up?
So, yeah, just click on.
Aha.
And click that somewhere, and you should be able to. You haven't got a pocket you need to hold that, I'm afraid.
Okay, can everybody hear? Yeah. Okay, well, thank you very much for the introduction. So yeah, I'll be talking to you about patents and a career as a patent attorney. So I thought it would be good to start with a little sort of biography about how I came to be where I am. So I graduated from Durham University with a Master's in Chemistry in 2011, and I specialised in inorganic and physical chemistry. I then went on to do a PGCE in secondary education, and that was here in York, and I completed that in 2012. But I decided that secondary education was not for me, and I began a PhD also here in York, which I finished in 2016, and I was working in the Centre for Hyperpolarisation, which is on the Science Park here, and I was specialising in, again, inorganic chemistry. So then I started a research associate in the same research group, and about 3 months into my research associate position, I started considering a career change, but I didn't know what career to change to. And so I went and spoke to the career service in York, and they were very good. I had a general careers chat, and we chatted about what I enjoyed about the research associate position, what I didn't enjoy. And it was actually the career service that mentioned a career in IP, intellectual property. And so I then applied to go on an open day with Marks and Clerk, which are the company that I currently work for. And the open day was really useful, so I do recommend doing that. If you see any open days advertised with any IP companies and you're interested, then yeah, apply for that, because they kind of open your eyes and give you a good insight into the career. So after the open day, I thought, yep, this sounds like the career for me, and I applied to Marks and Clerk and was successful, and began working for them in the Edinburgh office. And I started last September. Okay. Oh, something strange has happened with my slides, unfortunately. But so I'll just give you a little bit of background about Marks and Clerk. So it was founded in Birmingham in 1887, and that was by Dougald Clerk and George Marks, and they were the Scottish inventor of the 2-stroke engine and a Lithuanian railway engineer. By numbers, Marks and Clerk employ 625 people, and they also have an offshoot business, which is Marks and Clerk Solicitors, and they have 17 offices worldwide. That's a good slide. Okay, so these are the offices that Marks and Clerk have. So it's a UK-based firm, as you can see, but there are also offices in Canada, China, France, Luxembourg, Hong Kong, Malaysia, and Singapore. So it's really a global firm. And in intellectual property, this is very useful because often inventors will want to protect their invention in multiple countries. So it's useful to be able to provide advice for different countries. It's okay. It seems to be okay. It was just that one slide for some reason.
All right, okay.
Sorry about that. So firstly, what is intellectual property? Well, according to the World Intellectual Property Organization, IP refers to creations of the mind, inventions, literary and artistic works and symbols, names, images, and designs used in commerce. And according to Cornell University, IP is any product of the human intellect that the law protects from unauthorized use by others. So the important point to note about intellectual property is that it doesn't necessarily give you the right to use your product or your invention, but it does give you the right to stop others from using it and making money from it. And there's a huge range of different types of intellectual property. I specialize in patents, but there are also trademarks, trade secrets, designs, copyright, and know-how as well. But I'm just going to be focusing on patents. It is useful to know about the whole range of intellectual property that's available because you can use a combination to protect your product. So, for example, if you have a piece of software, then you can protect that using patents and copyright to get the best protection for it. So, focusing on patents, a patent is a legal document and it's granted by the state for an idea which is new, inventive, industrially applicable, and not excluded. Patents will last a maximum of 20 years, and they're available for both incremental developments and revolutionary technologies. So there are some exclusions. Some things can't be patented, and this is actually quite interesting to look at from a biotechnology point of view, because there are quite a few exclusions that are relevant to biotechnology. However, if your invention is new, inventive, industrially applicable, and is not excluded, then you should be able to obtain a patent for it. So I thought it would be useful to just look into the exclusions, what cannot be patented. So if an inventor comes up to you and their invention comprises a scientific theory, discovery, or a mathematical model, an aesthetic creation, including literary, dramatic, musical, or artistic works, a method of performing a mental act, or a presentation of information as such. So if that is all the invention is, then unfortunately that is excluded. You can't patent that because your invention has to be industrially applicable. On the other hand, if they come to you with a scientific theory or discovery and you can apply that to industry, then perhaps it could be patented. Also, and I recommend paying attention for this part because the next slide will involve some audience participation, hopefully. Also excluded are any method of surgery, diagnosis, or therapy. So you can't patent vaccinations, for example, because you can't patent anything that will ameliorate diseases or disorders. But you can patent cosmetic treatments, so long as they don't fall under surgery. Also, you cannot patent, patent treatment of matter outside the body. That's okay. And if something falls under a method of diagnosis, it actually has to include every step of diagnosis, including the decision-making factor. Okay. So, is it patentable? A method of piercing ears. Does anyone have any ideas from the previous slide? If it was a new method of piercing ears, and it was inventive and industrially applicable, would you be able to patent that, or is it excluded? Exactly, it's cosmetic, yeah. So yeah, you're right. Yep, you can patent a method of piercing ears because cosmetic treatments are not excluded, so long as they don't fall under surgery, which in this case it wouldn't. So yep, there are patents out there for piercing guns. You also can't patent the human body at various stages of its formation and development, or the simple discovery of one of its elements. You can't patent processes for cloning human beings, which is probably quite a good thing. Processes for modifying the germline, and uses of human embryos for industrial or commercial purposes. And finally, processes for modifying the genetic identity of animals, which are likely to cause them suffering. You can't patent that. So if an inventor came up to you and they had a method of modifying the genetic identity of animals, but they could prove that there was a substantial medical benefit, then it would be your job to try and argue for that and to say that this is not an excluded subject matter. You can't patent any variety of animal or plant or any essentially biological process, not being a microbiological or other technical process. And also you can't patent any essentially biological processes for the production of plants and animals which are not microbiological. So one more slide that is requires some audience participation. Do you think that a method of culturing yeast would be excluded? Oh, some people think not, some people think so. Why not? Who thought not?
Well, it's industrially relevant for a start, a method of culturing yeast.
Yep.
Beer, so.
It is industrially relevant, but actually you can patent it because it is a microbiological process, so it's not excluded. Yeah, so you're right. Yeah. Okay, so why bother patenting things in the first place? And why do patents exist? Well, patents give companies the incentive to invest and to invent. So some inventions will take years to develop, and often at very high expense. So a company doesn't want to put a huge amount of money into their research and development in order to invent something useful for another company to be able to just copy that and make money out of it. It wouldn't make sense. So patents are crucial to protecting market position, and they're a primary asset of early stage companies. So often investors will want to see that a company has patents that protect their products before they will consider investing. So patents are incredibly useful. And also patents promote the dissemination of information. So all patent applications are published. So they're all free to access, and actually they're really useful for research as well. There's a huge amount of free information out there in patent applications that you can access and use. And Abraham Lincoln, a nice quote from him, said that the patent system secured to the inventor for a limited time exclusive use of his inventions, and thereby added the fuel of interest to the fire of genius in the discovery and production of new and useful things. So some of you may never have seen a patent application before, so I thought it might be useful to go through what exactly it comprises. So firstly, there will be a reference number, as shown here. And there'll also be a date of patent. This will be the filing date. This is a really useful piece of information because you can calculate from that how long the patent has left. Because as I said, they only last for 20 years. Then there'll be an abstract. This will give you a sort of a brief summary of what is included in the patent application. There could be some cross-references to related applications, a field of the invention and the background. There might be some figures as well. And there'll be a brief summary, a brief description of the drawings, and a detailed description of the invention. And also if any amino acid sequences are included in the application, then there'll also be a sequence listing. And this is included so that the sequence can be searched in order to make sure that it is actually novel, a new sequence. And of course, there'll also be an experimental. So in order to gain protection for your invention, you need to prove that it's plausible that what you're claiming is novel, inventive, and will address the problem at issue. And so the example section is required in order to do this. And the example section is really useful for researchers to look at because this will give you a whole load of experimental and some characterization data. So it could actually be really useful for your research. And the most important part of the patent is the claims. So the claims really carve out the area of science that you are protecting in your patent. And so the claims are the sort of part of the application that the patent attorney will spend the longest amount of time working on to make sure that they protect the invention properly. So the process of patenting, so normally it begins with an inventor identifying an invention. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes an inventor will just give you a lot of information and they want you to come up with the invention from the information they give you. But initially there's a lot of conversation between the inventor and the patent attorney. Then the patent attorney will draft the patent application and they'll file it at the relevant patent office. The application will be searched and examined by the patent office, and this will be done by a patent examiner. And they're looking to see if the invention is novel, inventive, industrially applicable, and not excluded. So they may during their search come across some relevant prior art, which sort of shows that the invention isn't novel. It might have already been disclosed previously. And so the examiner will then raise an objection. They'll say, hey, this isn't novel. And so you will then, as a patent attorney, have to communicate with the examiner to try and either overcome the objection, to say, yes, it is novel, what you're on about, or you might have to amend the claims in order to gain novelty over the prior art. So there'll be this sort of back and forth between the patent attorney and the patent examiner, which could go on for up to a few years, and then eventually the examiner will not raise any more objections if you've proven that the invention is novel and inventive, and the patent will go to grant. And after this, the inventor will pay annual renewal fees to keep the patent in force. So the process is actually quite lengthy, and depending on the number of countries that you will want to file the patent in, that sort of alters the duration of this process. And also the cost. It can be incredibly costly, especially if you want to file in a large number of countries. So the role of the patent attorney is to meet with the inventors, to draft and prepare the patent application, and to respond to communications from the patent office. You need to present the applicant's case in writing. So a large proportion of the job is responding to examination reports and arguing for novelty and inventive step of the invention over what's in the prior art. So yeah, good communication skills are really essential in the job. You might also attend hearings and litigation where you have to present the applicant's case in person or instruct counsel. Instruct overseas attorneys or receive instructions from them. So as I mentioned, the inventor might want to file their application in a huge range of different countries. And in that case, you would have to liaise with foreign agents in order to make sure that happens. Advise on commercial and strategic issues, and also search for competitors' patents. So you need to understand freedom to operate. So for example, someone from a company might come to you and say, well, we're using this process to produce this product, and we've just realized that we might actually be infringing on someone else's patent. And so you would then have to look into the claims of that patent and compare it with their process and work out whether actually they have the freedom to operate or whether they don't. And also business development and management roles. So as part of the job, you will attend conferences. There'll be a lot of networking, trying to sort of create new clients, or just sort of working out what's going on in the field of interest and keeping up to date with the technology. So a typical day in the life. So it's around a 9 till 5 job. So you'll arrive into the office normally before 9. That's good. Make a cup of tea, and this is actually a tea strainer from a patent application. Then you'll check emails and your list of tasks and their deadlines. So there'll be quite a big part of the job is making sure that you meet deadlines. So when you have to respond to an examination report, for example, the examination office sets a deadline for that. And you need to make sure you meet that deadline, because if you don't, that might actually cost the client money in order to extend the deadline. And so either the client will have to pay or the company will have to pay. So you have to really keep on track with deadlines. Then you'll work on your first task, and the first task could be any one of these listed. So you might have a client meeting, client phone calls, you might need to clarify the law and call up the patent office and ask them for advice about something. Attend conferences, attend training days, company meetings and opposition hearings. These are all tasks of the patent attorney. Marks and Clerk provide a very good training academy. From 12 till 1, twice a week, the trainee attorneys will attend webinars where we'll learn about relevant case law. And so from 12 till 1, I might have a webinar with the training academy. Then I'll have lunch, and then might meet with my supervisor to discuss feedback on some cases that I've been working on, and then work on the second task, and as I said, leave the office at about 5 o'clock. So typical attributes, it's really important to have an interest in science because you're going to still be working in science, and preferably a broad interest because you don't know what inventions you're going to be working on. So typically I work on chemistry, chemical inventions, but it could be anything. Just depends what the inventor comes to you with. So it's good to have a broad interest in science. You need an analytical mind because you're going to need to find answers to problems, and you need to be adept at arguing cases, especially arguing in written communications, because this is the sort of main part of the job, is communicating with examiners. So you need good written skills for that. You need to be able to outline clear arguments. And also the ability to work alone. So once qualified, but even while you're training, you will be sort of working independently. I actually work in my own office, and so you need to sort of be prepared for that because you might currently be used to working in an open plan office and having a lot of people around you. So yeah, it is a little bit different in that respect. And good organisation and time management, because you're going to need to juggle your workload to meet those deadlines that are very important. So for interviews, if you're interested in applying and you attend some interviews, the interviews will often have several rounds of interviews. They'll include written tests, so you might actually be tested on your grammar and your spelling, technical writing skills, and also science knowledge. At one of my interviews, I was given some science questions, some basic chemistry questions. It was just to make sure that I definitely had the background knowledge that they needed. And I was quite surprised at that. But yeah, you might be given something like that. Presentations as well. Typically that's a second round of an interview. They might ask you to present your PhD project or your master's project, or on any topic that they randomly choose. So you have to be prepared to do that. And there might be several panel interviews as well that make up the process. And so if you're interested in the job, you need to consider whether you want to work in a private practice or in-house, because actually there are some pretty big differences there. So if you want to work in a private practice, then you're going to have a range of different clients. They might be people in universities, or they might be large pharmaceutical companies, small startups, a big range. But if you work in-house, then you're always working for the one client, and it works quite differently. So in private practice, we need to communicate with our clients a lot. It's a big part of the job. If you work in-house, it'll be much easier to communicate with your clients because you're working with them every day. You also need to consider whether you want a career as an attorney, but you might also like the idea of becoming an examiner and arguing against novelty or inventiveness of new inventions. You might prefer the idea of being a paralegal staff member, or a technology transfer officer at a university, for example. And also, you might not want to specialise in patents. You might prefer other areas of intellectual property, like trademarks, if you're interested in brands. So these are all good things to consider. Okay, so the balance. Well, the good is that the job is interesting. You might have some really strange inventions to look at. For example, this one. This is, I think, it's an ear protector for dogs, so that when they're eating their food, their ears don't go in their food. bit odd. But you might have that, and you might have to argue that that's novel and inventive and industrially applicable. So, yeah. It's intellectually challenging because you're working at the forefront of technology, so you're constantly learning. This is new science that you're dealing with, so you're always learning. There's a variety of work. You'll achieve professional qualifications as a result of the training. And there's a high earning potential. Once you're qualified, the salary will increase quite dramatically. And there's long-term career development and future prospects because you're a qualified scientist and a qualified lawyer, so you're quite highly sought after. However, the sort of bad side is that there are examinations, so there are UK and European qualifications, and there'll be a minimum of 3 years training, but typically 5 years, and there are examinations throughout that period. So you need to consider that side. Yeah?
What are these qualifications for the 5 years?
This is to become a qualified attorney, so it's with the Chartered Institute of Patent Attorneys, and so you can become just a UK qualified attorney or also a European qualified as well. It's important to be both, really. And so you need to pass these qualifications in order to be an attorney. Yeah. Oh, another question? Actually, you don't need qualifications to be an examiner, but you can sit qualifications in your own time just to sort of progress your career. So examiners don't have the same requirements. I think quite often examiners will sit some European exams just because it's useful for their future career if they maybe felt like ever changing. But yeah, but you don't need to. And also it's deadline driven. So yeah, you're always conscious of juggling deadlines and making sure that you're setting your tasks in the right order in order to meet all of the deadlines. Okay, so I'm going to finish with some useful websites. So we've got the Marks & Clerk website. There's also Inside Careers, which is a really useful website to look at for intellectual property jobs. And I had a few booklets on the table there, which are from the Inside Careers website. So yeah, I recommend looking at those. Then there's the UK IPO, the Chartered Institute of Patent Attorneys as well. And I think that's all of the useful websites. Okay, so thank you very much for listening. If there's any further questions, I'll happily take them. Yeah?
Yes, I'm doing some research and literature searches. I found a number of patents all seem to be the same patent, but they were dated. They had different dates, different years.
Right.
1950s, 1970s. Are companies allowed to do this?
No. So there's been some crackdown on this because it used to be that companies could file a patent application and it expires in 20 years. So they would tweak something very slightly in order to get a new patent application. And they'd argue for novelty. They'd say, oh, this methyl is now a hydroxy group and that's made a huge difference. They're really clamping down on that. So it's much more difficult to do that now. So now it shouldn't be the case that you see applications to the same thing 20 years after the first. But what you might see are, you can file divisional applications. So you might see an application and then another that looks the same, maybe filed within 10 years of the first or 5 years. And they will have the same priority date as the first, so they will actually expire at the same time as the first, and that's just to try and cover some extra little bits and pieces. But the 20 years should now be final. Yeah. Yeah.
So once you have all your examinations and most of your training done, how easy is it to find jobs out of UK or generally in Europe?
Out of UK, well, Europe would be fine because you'll be European qualified, although you don't have to be, but generally everyone sits the European exams, so that would be fine. You can definitely look for jobs in Europe. Outside of Europe, I know that the UK and European exams are looked upon very highly, but you would still have to train in another country and pass the exams that they have, because their laws will be different. So although they're looked upon highly, unfortunately, you will still have to pass further exams. Yeah.
So when you file patents and you file in the UK and EU, do you have to send them to someone else to file in another country, or do you need to work on that as well?
Yeah, so you would normally, often you'll file a UK patent to start with, and you have a year after filing in order to decide where you want to go with the patent. If you think you want to file it globally, then within that year you would file what's called a PCT patent, but basically it's an international patent application. And after filing that, that gives you some more time to then decide where exactly your invention is going to be really, really useful and where you'll make the money from. And then, so I could file the UK patent and the PCT patent. If after that you wanted to file in America, then it would definitely go to an American attorney. And so it would be sent over for them to file. And
Is that why you've got so many satellite offices?
yeah, that's right. That's why it's so useful having firms in a range of different countries. Also because then you although I wouldn't ever be qualified in Canadian patent law, say, you get a sort of good understanding of it from working with them, which is also useful if a client's interested in filing in Canada. Yeah.
I guess if you filed it first here, you'd be the person liaising them with these overseas
Yeah.
patent attorneys.
Yeah.
I guess in the interest of time, we
Oh.
have to move on to Fiona. So thank you very much to Kate. So Kate is around. You're around for the sort of networking session as well. So again, if you want to sign up for there's a much smaller group, and you can sort of, I could say grill, but talk to Kate on a sort of small group basis about this. You're very welcome to do so. So now, welcome to Fiona, who's going to talk to us about scientific publishing. And Fiona's with Taylor and Francis Group. So
Yes.
welcome.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
So there we go. So my current job title is Managing Editor for Chemistry Journals at Taylor and Francis. And I'll be talking a bit about scientific publishing with a focus on journals because that's what I know and it's often the most relevant one for science and technology. And then also a little bit about science communication, which depending on who you talk to, publishing falls within science communication or it runs alongside it or they have a difficult relationship. But moving on to my background. So I did an undergrad degree in physics at UCL. And even when I was doing my undergrad, I knew that I wanted to do something a little bit more in between humanities and sciences without a pure focus on scientific research. So while I was at UCL, even though my main degree is in physics with a focus on biophysics, I also took modules from the UCL Science and Technology Studies department, so I did little bits of history of science and philosophy of science. And I think it was seeing the kind of social context that science works in was the thing that I was most interested in, and seeing how personalities and money and things like that can affect science. So I knew that I wanted to be involved in the scientific community, but probably not at a bench doing research all day, every day. So when I graduated, I started working at Taylor and Francis, which is one of kind of 4 or 5 big publishers. I think journals publishing is quite unique in that I think about 4 companies have about 80% of the market share for articles that are published. So there really is a very small number of companies kind of dictating what happens in the market right now. And Taylor and Francis, I think things kicked off around 1798 with a journal that's still published today, and arguably is the oldest commercially published journal called Philosophical Magazine. So I started there in 2014, 2015, working on the physics and material science journals. Thank you very much. So I went in sort of sticking to the academic area that I knew. And once I was there, I sort of realized that not everyone, or kind of almost anyone, has a scientific background that works in scientific journals. So most of what I'm going to say isn't subject specific in any way, because publishing is kind of seen as its own field, and everything is more or less comparable across scientific fields. So then around a year ago, carrying on working at Taylor and Francis, I started to do a master's in science communication at Imperial. So that's why I've got the kind of dual interest in publishing and scientific communication. So the master's covers little bits of things that are relevant to publishing, but also science policy, science ethics, and things like that as well. So when you look at academic publishing as a whole, you can roughly break it down into these 4 areas. So there's books, which tend to dominate in humanities and social sciences, where you're more likely to have single or dual authorship, and there isn't the same kind of time crunch to get research out, say in history compared to quantum computing or something like that. Databases are often maintained by publishers, although you kind of might think of them as standalone products. So there's things like the chemical structures database and the protein data bank, and going all the way to newspaper archives and archives of other historical documents and letters and things like that. And then most of the big publishers also have a kind of digital products arm, which will be the things that sort of go alongside publishing, like Elsevier produced Mendeley, which you can use to manage citations and things like that. And Taylor & Francis is about to launch Wisdom AI, which is a kind of artificial intelligence data bank as well, that analyzes publications, and you can use it to track trends in authors and institutions, in topics, and see what's changed over time and things like that. But the main focus is journals, which is what I work on. There are hundreds of thousands of journal articles published each year, and it's also probably the one that's going through the most change at the moment in terms of open access and subscriptions and library budgets, and it's an interesting time to work in journals publishing. Journals publishing, journal articles also kind of taking on a greater significance for authors as they're becoming increasingly, people's salaries and PhD qualifications are starting to depend even more on their publications. So it's often quite a high stress and high stakes situation for the authors, more than publishing a book would be, which means that occasionally tensions run slightly high, but generally 99% of the time everything's running smoothly. So the main departments that go into journals publishing, editorial, which I will come back to because that's what I work on and know the most about. And then you have production, which is basically everything from acceptance onwards in terms of handling articles and manuscripts. So that includes copy editing, typesetting, publishing it online, or even printing still. Marketing, so promoting the journals. And that's quite an interesting field at the moment because the idea of who the customer is changing just about weekly. So you want people to read your journals, but you also want them to submit to them, but you also want libraries to subscribe. So there's quite a lot of factors at play in marketing and promotion of journals right now. Sales used to be almost exclusively selling big subscription packages to institutions, to research institutions and universities, but that's also moving more towards the open access side of things. So sales is starting to change more in the last 2 or 3 years. Peer review, I'm talking specifically about in-house publisher tasks right now. So peer review is actually the kind of mechanisms behind submissions and peer review. So we have a team that's dedicated to managing the online submission sites, and everything varies completely on a journal by journal basis. So I think about 98% of journals right now use an online submission system, although there are still ones that manage it manually over email. I'm assuming there's none still using Post, but you never know. And in terms of peer review, the site will depend on whether it uses single or double-blind peer review. So single-blind means that the author's identity is visible, but the reviewer's identity is anonymous. Double-blind is that they're both anonymous, and there has been a recent trend for open peer review now, where the reviewers are named or the comments are published alongside the article. And then digital, as part of our company, is, well, the big thing and the way that most people interact with journals is the website. So it's maintaining the website, making sure that it's working well, as well as adding new features. So something that we added recently is kind of 3D visualizations and being able to upload. It's not popular with everyone. So being able to load like 3D maps of the world with things colored by country or chemical structures and things like that. And moving specifically to editorial. So there's a few different ways that an editorial department can be set up. But in general, editorial is the content of a journal and effectively the sort of lifetime of an article up until the point that it's accepted. So you can either have internal editorial managing the peer review, which is how things are at the kind of Nature research body of journals, or more commonly, external editorial handling the peer review. So that would mean that you would have an in-house editorial contact at the publisher, which would be me, as well as an academic, normally in a full-time position, or an independent researcher who actually handles sending articles out to peer review and making content decisions. So that kind of varies on a journal-by-journal basis on which tasks are done at the publisher and which ones are done by the academics who have other positions as well. But these are tasks that in almost every publisher will be done by the in-house editorial team. So the aims and scope, kind of what a journal is about and what the title is and what it wants to publish. So that involves kind of tracking trends and seeing what topic of a journal would actually serve the community that it's working in the best and kind of where the future directions of research are going. Content, so kind of judging what's working with academic editors to judge like what's appropriate for the content of a journal, advising authors before they submit whether it's an appropriate forum, things like that. Financial planning is a big bit of it. They are like commercial journals that you have to keep an eye on. The main sources of income would be open access revenue and subscriptions. And then the main things that you spend money on are the actual production costs, as well as paying these academic external editors. And then the big two that take up the most of my time probably are publication ethics, which is where things tend to get quite interesting. So that's handling areas of plagiarism, data fabrication, legal issues, compromised peer review, things like that. So that's one of the things that's like almost entirely run inside the publisher. The academic editor is generally less involved in. So publication ethics makes up such a big part of the job. There is a committee, the Committee on Publication Ethics, or COPE, which has been established from representatives from different publishers to kind of manage these sort of situations and set out best practice. And there's also blogs reporting on things like this, so Retraction Watch. I'm not sure if you've heard of it, it's quite an interesting look into the world that goes around publishing and the scandals, or what counts for a scandal. And then the other main thing that I work on is bibliometrics, so anything that's kind of quantifiable around publishing. So looking at citations, looking at how many times articles are downloaded and where they're downloaded, and looking at who submits and how that varies by country over time, and kind of tracking all the journals by trends. So there's a few different ways that journals publishing can work, and one that I was not aware about at all until I started working is that society publishing makes up a huge chunk of any of the big traditional publishers. So a lot of learned societies have the kind of membership base and the influence to publish scientific journals, but they're not necessarily large enough, or it's not necessarily worth their time and money to have in-house copy editors and printers and things like that. So they will put their journals out to tender, and publishers will bid on them, and they can be on a rolling contract of normally between 1 and 7 years. So that kind of varies. That's slightly more common in humanities and social sciences, whereas at least in physical sciences, a lot of the big learned societies are publishers in their own right, like the Royal Society of Chemistry or Institute of Physics and things like that. And then open access, which is one of the biggest changes in the last few years. So in essence, it's research that's been published without a paywall. And it's really accessible to anyone, anywhere, as long as they have an internet connection. One of the main differences between open access and just making an article free to access is that the copyright stays with the author, whereas in most cases, traditionally, the copyright's been transferred to the publisher. So that's the kind of important distinction between a publisher just removing a paywall and an author actually having an open access article. There's various different kinds of open access, and they're based on whether a fee was paid by the author or when it is freely available, so immediately or 12 months after publication and things like that. And then repositories, so they've been quite common in physics and computer science for a while, having the archive, and it was gradually starting to spread to other areas, having chem archive and bioarchive and things like that. So that's where authors can post preprints, which are versions of their article that haven't had any changes made as a result of a publisher. So that includes not only typesetting and kind of making it into a nicer PDF, but also the effects of peer review. So it has to be the version without any changes made based on the comments of reviewers. And then the main things I found interesting about moving from a science undergrad degree to publishing, I think it was mentioned by a few people this morning, but it's that kind of getting used to ambiguities and uncertainties and knowing that not everything can be as proven and precise as you're used to things having to be in physics. So knowing that in order to provide the best service to a customer, it's quite often better to have something done quickly and in their best interests, rather than being able to prove every single bit of it to yourself, and it would probably just be yourself anyway. So things like, for example, if an academic editor asked me, what is the sort of spread of topics that my journal's publishing each year? I remember going through a list of maybe 500 or 600 articles that the journal had published in a year and trying to match it up to the general areas. And if you got really bogged down on being like, is this one specific article photonics or optoelectronics, you're not providing the overview that that person's used to. So it's kind of switching away of thinking to a slightly more big picture view that publishing would have to have, rather than getting bogged down in details. And then moving over to science communication, which is the other thing that I'm doing my master's in at the moment, or just wrapping up. So science communication can count as kind of talking about science in any context, in any situation, no matter who's doing the talking and who's doing the listening. It's quite often thought of as a scientist sort of sharing what they've been slaving away on with the public and generously passing on their information. But more often than not, it is a conversation that gets information across and kind of communicates science effectively. So one of the kind of most interesting examples that I can think of science communication and how to do it well is that there's historically been this huge problem with communicating climate change, just because it's quite depressing and very abstract, and you want specific actions out of people. Once you've communicated climate change, you want them to change their behavior. So it's one of those cases where you would need to think about how you're talking to and their values and their priorities, more than if someone doesn't care about polar bears, there's no real point in telling them about the polar bears if what they're concerned about is whether sea level is going to change their holidays. And I was talking to someone recently who was saying that the most effective way of communicating climate change that they've seen so far is actually through religious groups, because they were able to have this discourse of kind of like keeping our world in balance, and it's a forum that people are already going to hear about the natural world in. So it actually fit quite well with that, and it played into the people who are listening's values. And that's actually one of the ones that's had the most effective changes to behavior based on climate change. So one of the kind of roles of a science communicator that I hadn't thought of much before is that someone described it to me as being like an art critic. So you're playing a different role to a scientist promoting their own research. And it's kind of useful to have someone who is questioning science research and kind of placing it in society, as well as just communicating exactly what science has happened and kind of taking a professor's words verbatim and sharing them. And I think that kind of role of a science critic was something that I hadn't thought about before. I found really interesting. So yeah, that was about it from me. If you've got any questions, either on publishing or the sort of wider communication things, I'm really happy to hear them. Yeah. That's kind of completely separate, but at the moment I'm kind of looking at my like media and advertising and journalism, as well as publishing and sort of communication within the scientific community as well as outside to the public. Cool.
Translate the science communication into a career or a job. Where might you be working or who might you be working for? Do you have any ideas on that?
Well, it's a huge range of things. There's quite a lot of people I know working in press offices at universities and kind of working to represent the work that's going on in universities, as well as in learned societies like IChemE or the Royal Biological Society and things like that. I'll have communications and press teams. But it's also sort of pure science journalism, kind of ties in science communication as well. And it's all just about kind of tailoring your output for who you're talking to. Yeah.
What does your typical day look like?
So my typical day is quite email focused. It's generally, as editorial, you're sort of a hub for all the different departments to talk to and to talk to people externally. So it's generally maybe responding to authors who want to know what the impact factor of a journal is and whether they should submit or not. It could be examining articles to see whether they breach EU trade sanctions. It's quite a big kind of UN trade sanctions. You have to look at content and make sure that there aren't any sanctioned topics in the article. It's talking to editors about if something is happening on the submission system or if they've received a duplicate submission or if something has happened with the peer review that looks suspicious. It could be investigating that. It could be kind of talking to departments internally and planning marketing campaigns. So most of our marketing and production teams work across all subject areas. So you're kind of taken as the subject area expert within the company. So sort of anything chemistry related would come to me.